Let's go. All right. That's it. I think I have a really fun, really open case that's actually been passed around at this tournament, so I want to use it now so that no one else can find out about it. We want to talk about the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And so, you guys know okay, with that. Beautiful. So what it basically says is that given the advent of genetic testing, like successful genetic testing, we believe that no institution, the government, insurance industries, like just employers, what have you, should be allowed to test, or to compel genetic testing from an individual. Why is this important? It's important because we're going to set a caveat around that. This round is taking place at like some point in the future where the cost of getting like your gene sequence, have someone look at your genes, like know what genes you have, what risks you're susceptible to, is going to be very low. Right now the cost is about $10,000, and like they're projecting by however many years it's going to be like $1,000, and then smaller and smaller. The very, very small cost is going to be able to tell you what sort of diseases you're susceptible to. Like the reason this is kind of brought up is because they found like a link to type A diabetes, like one particular gene just basically predicts that you're going to get it. And we think with the advent of more research, you're going to come into a system where very cheap genetic testing is able to indicate all sorts of major diseases that you're going to get, like how likely are you to get heart disease, cancer, and so on and so forth. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act soared through the House with only like 3 votes against. Hasn't come to the Senate yet. We say it's a terrible idea to get rid of it.
Okay. Who would this apply to exactly? You said insurance agencies, is it extended to employers? Can you just give us some more examples?
Yes, insurance agencies, employers, government, any institution that's going to compel genetic testing before you do it.
Before what?
Before giving something like a job, insurance.
So it can't be part of the application process or anything like that?
Actually, well, it could probably be part of an application process, but it couldn't be a mandatory process.
Okay. So, okay.
In addition to not being allowed to test, they're also not allowed to use the information if they do come across and discriminate against people based on their genetic risk factors. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you couldn't charge someone a higher insurance premium because they have a genetic predisposition to adopt a disease, for example?
We actually don't think that's the case. And the reason being is because that is directly influential to the case. Like the insurance system would actually break down into that instance, get into that case.
So they could discriminate based on...
They can discriminate in premiums?
So you're gonna be able to get around this sort of thing very easily by just like saying like, oh, we're not gonna discriminate against this, but like here are 2 different insurance rates, or like this, we'll create some sort of company that says it's not mandatory, but if you go ahead and do it, you'll get a reduced rate.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Ask more questions because
I'm not sure. I think, can you explain that?
Okay. So I'm in the insurance industry,
yeah.
And you come to me not having had a test, or having had a test, and you say like, look at this, I'm not susceptible to anything.
Right.
I'm going to charge you a really low rate. So what's going to happen? All the people who get tested and realize they have really low rates of like getting particular diseases are going to come forward with that information. What's the rest of the pool going to look like? Really susceptible to disease, charging these high rates. So everyone in that pool will then have an increased incentive to like signal out and say like, hey, look at me, I'm less likely to get lots of diseases. Meanwhile, that portion of the population rates will get more and more expensive.
So you're saying that's okay, or?
We're saying that you should be able to have compulsory testing. Okay. Because we think the results are pretty much inevitable either way, and I think it's better to set the House.
All right.
Cool.
Marco.
3 points. First, preventative medicine. We think that if you know what sort of risk someone is susceptible to, you can act preventatively to prevent those risks. Very obvious point. If you know someone is susceptible to heart disease, you can put them on a diet regimen that really avoids it. If you know someone's really susceptible to cancer, you can start screening them more frequently. If you know someone's susceptible to diabetes, like you can check their blood sugar level all the time. You can act as soon as it happens. You know it's likely for it to occur. So we think this is really good. We think that in general, people are going to be kind of motivated to do this. But we think that unless you have a compulsory agenda by like an insurance agency or by the government, people aren't necessarily always going to do this on their own. So we think that on their side of the house, what's going to happen is people sometimes aren't going to want to go ahead and do this. One, we just see empirically that people don't always act in their best interest, right? Like, I guess it would be best if everyone who was like susceptible to heart disease got a test that, like got their blood tested for like cholesterol levels all the time and like checked that out and really acted preventatively in their favor. But people empirically don't do this. And we think that on our side of the house, since we can compel people to get this checked, that's going to encourage preventative medicine, we're going to get more preventative medicine on our side of the house. The second thing is we just think people have a psychological aversion to knowing what sort of diseases are likely to befall them. We liken this to the idea of like knowing the very minute you're going to die. For example, if you know that you're going to get Hutchinson's disease, you know that around 40, I think basically your brain's going to start to deteriorate, your brain's going to collapse, like it's a matter of months, and you'll just die. It's like a really terrible genetic defect. We can predict it with nearly 100% accuracy, and we think that people aren't going to want to learn these kind of things. We think that it's better to have that happen because you're going to act more preventatively in those circumstances. The other benefit we think we capture is that on our side of the house, it's possible to create a large database of individuals, right? We can know what the genetic code of everyone in the population looks like, what sort of diseases everyone is susceptible to, and act like on a group scale preventatively, right? So we can say that like, oh, this sort of disease is likely to spread through the population, and we can act on that, even though like if we didn't have some sort of compulsory testing, we wouldn't be able to get that information. Yeah.
Okay, but I mean, not every insurance company is as altruistic as you're making them out to be. Aren't they just as likely to test someone and say, well, preventative medicine might be really good for you, but we're not going to pay for it? I mean, isn't that the real fear?
Well, so they actually do have an incentive to do that, right? Because it's going to decrease the cost of this patient, right? Because if you know with some certainty that this person is going to get type A diabetes, you'd rather be paying for like checkups now than, you know, like treatment of their diabetes in the future. Like, this is the kind of thing that's going to want to happen. The other thing that we get is just sort of a government database of this kind of information that can exist. We think the government can actually be motivated in order to do this. Second point, insurance collapse. This is kind of like the leveling bit in the round, because I think ultimately when you see that there's a decrease in risk, like when people more fully understand what's going to happen to them and their bodies, right, the cost of insurance is going to go up. But who's it going to go up for? The people who have those diseases, the people most likely to get those diseases. Rich and I maintain that the highest cost for insurance are not things like breaking a bone or like getting the flu, but rather things like cancer, heart disease, diabetes. These are the things that rack up major costs. These are the things that people need medical insurance for. But what's going to happen is, when people understand those risks, the insurance companies are going to be able to charge people larger fees if they're likely to get those sort of things. So the people who are the worst off are the ones who are going to have to pay the most, right? We think that this is going to happen on either side of the house. First off, if you don't have the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act on our side of the house, right, insurance companies are just going to ask and they're going to price discriminate like that. But on their side of the house, you're still going to get the same sort of thing, because even if insurance companies can't compel you to get that genetic information, there's going to be a benefit for signaling that you are risk-free, right? They can charge you lower rates for that. And this whole analysis I explained that like the rest of the population that doesn't bother to signal is going to be charged higher rates, and they're going to have a greater incentive to go forth and do that. But also, if you just argue that there's some sort of world where the insurance industry will never ever be able to figure out what sort of things you have, right, then individuals are going to be able to game the insurance system, right? You'll be able to get a test on your own and then like apply for particular types of insurance that you think are likely. For example, if you have Hutchinson disease, you know you're going to die at age 40, then you might as well go out and take like a huge life insurance policy that's going to pay out really well for you and be like really advantageous to you. What's going to happen? The insurance industry is like going to fall apart basically because people are exploiting the risk. Yeah,
but isn't the whole theory of insurance preventing from having to pay for something that is unexpected, right? So I might not be genetically predisposed to these other diseases, but I still would want to buy insurance for those diseases because it might happen.
Well, what we think is going to happen is the cost of that insurance is going to be almost identical to you getting that treatment, right? Because they know with whatever certainty that you're going to end up getting that thing, right? So we don't think there's actually any risk to defray. If you have this particular gene, I don't know the number of it, you're going to get type A diabetes. There's nothing we can do for you. Like, we can act preventatively to like reduce the impact of that, but we're not going to like have it go away. Like, you'll want to get insurance, but the problem is that insurance is going to be much more expensive. All right. The third area I want to talk about is just why this is principally indifferent from any other type of information gathering we've already allowed these agencies to do. We really don't see why this is any different from just acquiring your family history or like your behavioral habits, like are you a smoker, right? In some cases, we actually already use the expression of these genes to discriminate against people. Like, I can look at Rich and know that he has brown eyes and be like, oh, like Rich is some kind of guy who has brown eyes and like is susceptible to these sort of things, right? That seems a little bit abstract, but if you consider other expressions of genes like, I don't know, the Y chromosome or having two X chromosomes, male and female, you'll see that we already have systems in place that discriminate. Females pay lower insurance rates than males. Like, people with family histories of heart disease, et cetera, pay more insurance than, or pay more for medical insurance than families that don't, right? And so we think that asking you to disclose this genetic information is like really not in any case different. The real impact of this, though, is that we already have a system set up in our society to avoid discrimination against those individuals, right? Although it isn't perfect, we try to avoid male and female like discrimination between these two facts. Like, so we don't think that they can make any argument that's going to be like, oh, you're going to get some sort of discrimination against people with bad genes. The reality is we already fight against that discrimination in the status quo, right? With disabled people, sick people, like, men and women, etc. We already have laws set up in place. We don't think we need to burden the system with extra laws, and we're really proud to propose to get rid of this.
Thank the Prime Minister and call upon the Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that the case of the government is founded on a couple of very very, very large assumptions about the way the insurance market works. And if you can dispel some of those myths that are embedded mathematically into a lot of their arguments, you'll see that a lot of the benefits they think they accrue don't necessarily materialize. So let's go through a couple of them. The first of all is that there is a vast difference between risk and a genetic guarantee. While the diabetes is a great example for their side of the case, it's sort of the exception that proves the rule. Even with things as like with high correlations with genetic risk, like say schizophrenia, in monozygotic twin tests, they're still only about 50-50. So like, even if someone had exactly your genes, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to develop the same medical conditions that you're going to develop. Right? This is true of not only schizophrenia, it's true of just about every single kind of healthcare issue you could possibly want to test. Well, why is that? Because behavior actually affects a lot more the way your body functions than genes. Take alcoholism. Now, I have a history of alcoholism in my family, but it's easily avoidable in terms of the insurance, in terms of from the perspective of the insurance company. As long as I regulate my behavior in a meaningful way and I don't, drink consistently like a 151 every single morning when I wake up and go out of bed, right? The point is this, is that your genes actually change over the course of your lifetime. And just because you have a gene doesn't necessarily mean it's switched on, right? And a lot of times behavior is what induces certain genes to turn on or turn off. So I think that there is a huge principal difference here between the risk of acquiring a certain disease and the guarantee. At the point that it is behavioral risk, it's not necessarily that are these insurance companies taking this into account, it's are they legitimately doing it. They could be taking it into account and still charging people high rates for insurance, maybe prohibiting them from even having health insurance because they are of their genetic risk factors, right? Even though the person has a clean bill of health and very likely is deserving of health insurance. We think that it is wrong to hold someone's genes something that they have no power over against them, simply because they have genetic risks for certain things that may never materialize. So that's assumption number one. The second huge assumption that I think underlies a lot of their arguments is that insurance companies are altruistic, right? That they want to cover people and that they'll act to, prevent the development of later costs down the road. If they find out someone has a huge genetic predisposition towards a certain terrible disease, they'll rush into preventative medicine in order to save their skins. That's not how insurance companies work at all. There is no bureaucrat sitting in an insurance company anywhere who's like, oh my God, Johnny might get sick. Someone call a doctor. He's thinking, oh my God, Johnny might get sick. Hike up his premiums. Charge him more because he's going to cost us more. Or hike up his premiums or cut him off coverage altogether. Right? They are risk-averse capitalist entities, and that means that if you have a huge genetic predisposition towards certain diseases, even if it's not going to affect your health in your lifetime, they're just as likely to just charge you so that they don't have to worry about if those symptoms do develop, or just not cover you at all. What that means is if you allow genetic prejudice, these things which, again, remember my first point, might have no basis in reality, you're going to cut people, deserving people, out of the healthcare system or charge people more. And because, remember, of the way the health insurance market works, larger insurance rates for a few people will correlate to larger insurance rates overall. If you allow people to take the genetic risk factors, like, oh my God, we're treating an area where there are 50% African Americans who have a massive genetic risk for sickle cell anemia. So we're going to take that into account. We're going to raise their premiums. That will raise the market rate, the average market rate for insurance in general, which means fewer people get health care based on information that means nothing. That's really, really problematic. Now the third, I think, really important fundamental assumption here, and this is the biggest one, is that we have an insurance market that is competitive. Now, I'm going out on a limb here. I know I'm speaking to a Republican, but markets don't solve all the time, all right? And the insurance market in the United States is a great example of an oligopoly. Now, I can prove this with empirical data in a brief moment. A lot of states have passed laws, put caps on punitive damages that can be awarded in suits, with the theory being that if you take out these random, awful lawsuits, insurance rates overall would go down because doctors' insurance rates would be less expensive, and therefore, the market would solve, competition would lead to more health insurance for everyone. In every state that's passed caps like that, what they've discovered is that there is, without any direct collusion, indirect collusion about the price of insurance, which means that people, even when you take those huge risk people out of the market, insurance doesn't go down for everybody else. Which means that even if we allowed their system and allowed insurance companies to use this massive prejudice to cut people out of the system so that they didn't have to pay for diseases, which, remember, might never manifest any symptoms in their lifetime, it doesn't guarantee better health insurance or cheaper health insurance for anybody. Which means that you're being principally unfair for no societal gain. We think that that's really, really problematic. My final point and my final observation is this. The purpose of healthcare and the purpose of assessing risk in our society in general is to try and get the maximum gain out of the minimum dollars in terms of covering people. But it's not just that. There are also ethical guidelines that need to guide how we distribute scarce medical resources in our society. Now, I personally think that we ought to opt into a system where everybody has insurance, but as long as we don't have that, right, I mean, Barack Obama, 2008, as long as we don't have that, I think the best way you can do it is to set very strong standards on what we are allowing insurance companies to take into account. And the difference between genetic risk and actual behavior is that actual behavior is a much better predictor of actual health. I know a hell of a lot more about your internal environment if I know that you're a smoker than I do if I even know your family history. And while he said it's not necessarily different from, knowing someone's exact genetic imprint is totally different from knowing their genetic history, I think that there's a clear distinction there. One is just a much higher level. It's a difference of degree, if not a difference of kind. But I would argue that you might even argue principally people shouldn't even be allowed to take family histories into account when assessing premium rates. I think that's fine as well. You should take an individual as they stand and measure their behavior. It's a far better predictor. It's more accurate, and not only that, it's more fair. It means lower insurance premiums for everyone and more health care in general. Sure.
Sure, Brendan, behavior may be a better predictor, but when insurance companies are able to access this sort of information, or are able to find it implicitly with signal theory, why wouldn't they use it, even though it's not perfect?
Right. This is the belief that it is absolutely inevitable, and we are completely powerless to prevent the bureaucrats and insurance companies from acquiring this information. I don't buy that. I think that a societal effort to actually contain this information and keep it in front of the people that actually need to see it, like the person themselves or their exact, their personal doctor, that's totally possible. It's doable. We limit the circulation of all kinds of medical information in the status quo. It's eminently reasonable to propose that we do the same kind of thing with this information. So going case study, the first argument they leveraged was that you could get better preventative medicine on their side of the house by allowing compulsory testing. Now, first of all, I would respond to this by saying compulsory testing is really, really a damaging thing to begin with. You're violating someone's bodily autonomy, the right to say what information they give or what information they don't give out. So that's problem one. But two, remember that you don't necessarily get better preventative medicine because of the reason I leveraged off case. Insurance companies aren't altruistic. They're looking to minimize their bottom line. They're not asking this information so they can help you. They're asking this information so they can determine whether or not they can charge you more for the health care they do give you. And he says, look, some people just won't know, and some people don't want to know, so we should force them to find out. I disagree with that, one, because of the idea that people should be able to decide what information they want to have access to or not. I mean, you might agree that on a rational level it makes more sense for you to know your genetic risk factors, but there are lots of people who, for principled or religious reasons, simply wouldn't want to be exposed to that kind of information. Take Christian scientists who object to modern medicine in general. But not only that, just because some people won't get this information doesn't necessarily mean that enough people won't, that we won't be able to reap some kind of short-term benefits from it if we allow that kind of information to circulate amongst the people who appropriately have access to it, namely the patients themselves who should be aware of their risk factors if they want to know, and their doctors. So the next argument he leveraged was that the insurance collapse is a serious risk. He says we're going to get larger frees, we can just have them ask and trade. Again, this is the inevitability argument. I don't buy it. I don't think there's any reason to necessarily believe we couldn't legitimately and legally contain this information to the most appropriate actors. And third and finally, he says that it's principally no different from family behavior or family history or behavior. Again, I think I've already shown that distinction. It's fundamentally distinct, and behavior is a far better, a far more accurate leading indicator. We're proud to oppose.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition and call upon the Member of Government. Hear, hear.
Thanks for calling me up to the floor, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to true friends on Side Up. Really appreciate your enjoying the tournament a lot as well. That being said, I want to get started by addressing the independent points of view from Brendan off case, and then I'll get on to the stuff that Andrew told us on case. Unfortunately, we don't hear as much from the LO as we would have liked to hear, and I think they missed some pretty good stuff that Andrew gave you. That being said, before we get started, I want to give you just a little bit of more information on signaling theory. Now, Andrew tells you specifically that signaling theory is going to answer how the insurance company is going to collapse. So I want to give you a little bit more information on this. Recognizing the world in which OP lives, sure, you can't be compelled to give any information to the insurance company, but you always have the choice of whether you want to go and get any sort of genetic testing on your own. And sure, I may not have any history of heart disease, for instance, in my family. So I have an incentive to go and get tested and have some sort of proof to do that. I can then go to an insurance company, someone who advertises that they might give good rates for people who show this, or maybe they don't have to advertise it, but it becomes known in the marketplace, and recognize that they're going to go ahead and see this as proof, and that's going to be your ticket to lower insurance. Now, sure, they're not going to prevent anyone else from discriminating against them, but at the point that you don't show them that, they're going to offer a different line of insurance, and it's going to be the insurance, like the regular insurance that we have today. And yet there's going to be a discounted marketplace for people who are willing to signal in and give themselves the information over to the insurance company that they don't have any risk. So that being said, the first thing we hear from them is the idea that there's a difference between genetic guarantee and risk, and that most things aren't certain. Now, sure, I agree that not all these genes are as good, are as perfect as when Andrew tells you, you're basically going to drop dead as soon as you turn 40. But recognize that at the point that they tell you that it might be a 50% risk. We tell you that in aggregate, these genes are a great predictor of people getting the disease. It doesn't tell you that each person is necessarily going to get it, but in aggregate, it provides a much better way for insurance companies to go ahead and make correct decisions, and also for how to allocate resources. Sure.
Then aren't you using those persons for whom that is not an accurate indicator as some kind of means to societal ends, and what about their right to be treated fairly?
Okay, so sure, some people may consider that as them being used as a means to an end, but I'm going to tell you, recognize that we don't think this is any different from how any sort of insurance system works in the status quo. We don't think it's going to be a unique change. Look at the point that I have to disclose my family history or automatically pay a higher rate for insurance when they ask, did your father or your grandfather have heart disease? Did he have heart failure from something like that? That's something that insurance companies basically are forcing me to give over to them in the status quo. We don't think that this is really any different. It's just doing the same types of things, but in greater scale. There's no sort of principled distinction between what's going to happen after the case. But then they tell us specifically genes change over time, that there's behavior induction, and sure, we agree with that, but unfortunately behavior isn't something that we can adequately judge. And we think that insurance companies, regardless of whether or not it's the correct thing to do, no thank you, are going to do it anyway. But then they say ultimately it's wrong to hold them to something that people can't change. But recognize we think it's done a lot in the status quo. We don't think we're going to make the problem any worse. Okay, let's move on to the second thing they talk about us. It's not talk about us, that they tell us. Sorry, I guess I can't speak tonight. They say, Brendan tells us that insurance companies are not altruistic, and instead of trying to prevent someone from getting disease, they're going to try to save the most money. Now, what Andrew and I are trying to tell you is that oftentimes these two things go hand in hand. Because recognize that if someone is going to have some sort of onset of the disease, something which is going to be expensive to treat going forward, we think it makes sense for the insurance company to go ahead and try and screen people and see that perhaps they should be put on the correct diet, or they should be seeing people on a semi-regular basis to try and prevent the disease from getting out of hand before they have to spend a lot of money on some sort of costly treatment. We think that ultimately insurance companies are rational actors in a capitalist system, and they're going to follow this information. But then they tell us that that a few people with higher rates will give higher rates for all. They talk about the oligopoly. Sorry, I'll take you on days. But recognize that we think that this is a little bit different in this example, because actually that's not even important. The important part here is that recognize this. We do guarantee higher rates for some people anyway, and that's going to happen on either side of the house. The important part that we think is going to happen is that ultimately there's going to be better overall care that's going to come out on our side of the house. Because we think that on either side, we agree that perhaps some sort of socialized healthcare system might be better. And recognize if that should happen, we think that we're going to get better healthcare on our side of the house because we have access to the genetic information for the entire population. And we think that overall that's going to provide for better tailoring of vaccines and better allocation of resources in the treatment process. And if that shouldn't occur, we think that there is going to be the incentive for certain people to be able to pay less. Because sure, at the point that insurance companies can make their profits, there's going to be some sort of limitation because people are going to refuse to pay for some ridiculously high rate. The last thing we hear about from Brendan on off case is this idea of ethical guidelines for how we should engage in distribution of medical resources. And they say that there needs to be a distinction between behavior and risks. And recognize that genetics, as we've been telling you a lot, work really well in the aggregate. And we think that the insurance companies, when they talk about pooling risk, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for the overall picture. And finally, this behavior can't be distinguished. That being said, I wanted to devote the rest of the time to talking about the stuff on case, because I think we just don't hear enough response here. The first thing Andrew talks about is preventative medicine, and a lot of the good things that we can get. We can tailor resources, we can test for causes. Doctors will be able to treat people better because they'll know that they're likely to have a disease caused by X rather than Y, because they can look at the genes and see that based on probability, it's much more likely to be that way. But then we hear two arguments from Brendan here. We hear this idea of violating autonomy. But recognize they don't respond to any of the stuff that Andrew explains to you during the third point. The fact that we compel this information from people in the status quo. We take things like family history. We already access genetic information when we require people to give over the color of their eyes. and the sex that they might be. And we think that they need to show you some sort of distinction between these two things. Sure.
Can an insurance company actually compel that I tell them what race it is? Can a job do it? As of my understanding, when I applied to college, it said fill in the bubble of your race optional. Aren't most
Okay,
decisions
so sure,
optional?
race may not be something that they can compel of you, but it recognizes the point that they can adjust the premiums based on whether or not you give up something like family information. In function, it's the same thing as it being compelled. They're already like discriminating on price on that function, and we tell you that it's not going to be any different on our side. But then they tell you that people should be able to make a choice as to whether this information should be like disclosed. And give you this idea of, perhaps people have religious reasons to try to get out of this. And Andrew and I tell you that sure, there may be like religious groups that are going to opt out of this system. And we tell you that that happens in lots of other ways in laws that we think are paternalistic. And we're going to say that sure, that might happen. But the thing we're concerned about is that overall, for the vast majority of society, people that don't opt out on religious grounds, we think that this paternalism is justified in the sense that it provides for better health care for those people, but not only for those people, for the rest of society as a whole. No thanks, sorry, I have to get to the rest of it. That being said, I want to get to the second point we talked about why the insurance industry collapses. And recognize on their side of the house, they think that ultimately we're overplaying the situation. They think that we are trying to make this sound a lot worse than it really is, because they think that we don't understand the way the insurance industry works. But recognize the information I give you about signaling theory. We think it's pretty clear that whether or not people voluntarily, individually are trying to do that, insurance companies in the end will get access to the information from people making the correct decisions individually. We also think that, recognize that at the point that we do think that socialized medicine is a reasonably likely outcome under the situation, where it's likely to see that everyone is willing, and will have to go to a government-backed source for insurance. At the point that private companies can't do that, we think we give you a much better system. Because we give you one where not only is everyone participating, but everyone's information has been pooled, so it's clear what types of things they're going to get. Andrew and I also tell you that at the point that the vast majority of spending in the healthcare industry is not for things like broken bones, but instead is for things like cancer and people trying to cure a disease that people have had for long periods of time. We think that ultimately we're going to get a lot better situation on our side of the house. The last thing I want to talk about is just specifically why we think that this is absolutely no different from what we do in the status quo. Recognize that in things like family history, we allow that information to be used in the decision of how much is charged for insurance. Whether or not we actually say they can ask for it or not, the end result is the same. We also disclose things like height, sex, eye and hair color, and things like that. And we think that these are genetic things. They're disclosed throughout society, whether it be we give it over to the government for things like your driver's license, whether it be that insurance companies have access to it. We think that stuff is out there in the public domain. We think that they need to give you a principal distinction as to why this is any different. And recognize finally, any sort of discrimination that might be done, we fight already in the status quo. We have reasons by which we fight that, things like the ADA. We give you better insurance, we give you better health care. We're proud to propose.
Hear, hear.
Thank the member of government. Call upon the member of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start off by addressing his introduction, which had to do with signaling theory. On their side of the house, in the PM, they asserted that insurance companies will know this anyways, but we didn't really understand why. They didn't really fully explicate that. So my partner clearly asserted, no, they wouldn't. Why would they possibly know? In response to that, Richie stood up and said signaling theory. They can adjust the premiums based on who gives them information, so then they're going to know who doesn't give them information will clearly have bad genetics. We think this is clearly a form of discrimination and would be outlawed under your plan. At the point where I'm giving people benefits who give me their genetic information, I'm clearly discriminating against those who do not give me this genetic information. Therefore, signaling theory does not work. This would be illegal to adjust benefits based on the genetic codes of different people. Therefore, the insurance companies could not do that, and they could never gain this information that they would say they had on their side of the house. That's the argument. I'm responding to it now because it was not clearly explained in that PM, and my partner didn't get a chance to. So we don't think that the insurance companies will ever know this because it's clearly unethical and illegal under your plan to do so. Now moving into Brendan's points, which I think really still stand. The first thing he talked to you about was that there's not always a correlation between your genes and what happens in real life. He made this example through various health examples, right? He said that simply because you have bad genes doesn't necessarily mean that in the end you're going to get this disease or you're going to suffer from any ailments. And I'd like to extend this example to other walks of life because I think it hits on a really important philosophy, which is that we should be judged on our lives and our actions in our lives and how our behavior and our genetics mix to form who we are, not simply based on what our genetics say we are predisposed to become. So if we say that anybody can compel us to give them this genetic genetic code, to give us our genetic manipulations. We can have jobs judging us based off this. Do you think it's okay for jobs to judge you based on how smart your genes say you are, how accomplished your genes say you are, rather than what you've accomplished within your own life? Do you think that's just? Do you think it's just for a college to admit you based on what your genes say, rather than what you've actually done? We think there's a lot to be said for judging people based on their own life. Number one, it incentivizes people to do good. If I know I'm never going to get, I'll take you in a second if you want to stand. If I know I'm never going to get health insurance because I have bad genes, what's the incentive for me to take care of myself? If I know I'm never going to get into college because I've had bad genes, what's the incentive for me to work hard in high school? We don't like this type of branding based on your genetics because it erases all of the principles that we stand for of social mobility and being judged based on your actions within this life rather than what you were born with. We think that we believe in equal opportunity on that side of the house because of that incentive. And that's what Brendan elucidated when he said that there's not clearly a correlation between genes and reality because we have this little thing in between called behavior, which is really important. The next thing that Brendan said is that insurance companies aren't always altruistic. They could hike up the premiums. And they say, yes, they could hike up the premiums and it makes sense to them. It makes sense for them to, it makes sense, okay, so he said they're not always altruistic. They're going to hike up the premiums and they're going to cut them off. In response to this, Richie said, well, it makes sense for insurance companies to encourage them to take these measures to prevent them from getting these diseases. Sure, it makes a lot of sense for an insurance company to help someone out not to get heart disease if they're going to take them on. But what makes a whole lot more sense, right? What makes a whole lot more sense? Cutting them in the first place. It is good to help the people, assuming that you have to take them, but it makes a lot more sense to cut all of the high-risk patients and only insure those patients who have very, very low risks. And seeing, as we said, that insurance companies are not altruistic but capitalistic, and that was not challenged on their side of the house, we believe that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to cut all the high-risk patients instead of encouraging them to be healthy, because that's going to be more effective, obviously, because they won't have to worry about their getting heart attacks down the road no matter what.
Yeah, but if you only have low-risk patients, how are you going to extract large fees out of them? Won't they demand to pay less?
No, they won't demand to pay less because of my next point, which Brendan said, which is this assumes the insurance is a competitive industry. And he proved to you, and this was never argued against, that there are, because of, in certain states, there are very limited insurance providers that can charge whatever they want. They can therefore take the low-risk patients, cut the high-risk patients because it's not a competitive industry, and still maintain all of their profits. That's what they never argued against. They said simply because it'll lower the risk pool that this hurts it, but I don't understand how that argument makes any sense. So we think that no, in response to your POI is Brendan's next point, which is that assumes a competitive insurance industry. All the insurance providers can simply hike it up. And even furthermore, even if they did have to lower their prices for high premium patients or for low risk patients, we think that so they'd lower their profits for low-risk patients, but they still wouldn't take on the higher-risk patients. That doesn't make any sense, because it's still going to be unprofitable to take on a high-risk patient no matter what, unless you're charging huge premiums, which is also extremely unethical to that high-risk patient. So either way, you lose. The next thing that Brendan talked about was the ethical guidelines, and that actual behavior, again, is a better prediction of your life than your genes. And we say that it's not ethical. On our side of the house, we say that it's not ethical for two reasons. First of all, it's not ethical to judge somebody and punish them, make them pay higher premiums, or make them not get insurance at all based on their genes rather than actuality. And second of all, because it's unethical to make them provide information, right? I hit on this in a POI. In most situations, we say that it's illegal to compulse them to provide information, right? Sure, insurance agencies can ask you about your family history, and I'm not sure of this, but I'm willing to bet that if you don't want to give them that family history, you don't have to give them that family history. At the point where they're compulsing you, they're saying you have to do this, then we don't think that should be ethical. We don't think that is ethical. And what they were going to say on that POI was that we can just charge them lower premiums for it, so that's basically discrimination. I'd argue that that's unethical on the status quo, right? That's discrimination, and it shouldn't be provided. And I'll get to more on that case side. So the next thing that they talk about, or when they go case side, they talk about is that you can prevent most things. First of all, and we have two responses to this, which Brendan hits on already, which is, first of all, you can prevent it by yourself, right? I can still go out and get the information and prevent myself from getting a heart attack, prevent myself from getting cancer. This does not mean that I should have to be compulsed to give that information to anybody who asks, to any job agency that I want to apply for. It doesn't mean I should have to give them that information. They only harped on the insurance agency and how they can help us. First of all, it would apply to a wide breadth of people besides the insurance agency that aren't necessarily trying to help you. Second of all, you can already help yourself, and you have no need for the insurance agency to play a role. The second argument under this, which I think is really interesting, is that people won't always do this, right? That people always don't know what is in their best interest. But I would feel that it's not always in your best interest to know exactly what your genetic predispositions are, right? What if you have a type of terminally ill cancer that cannot be treated? You guys set an example on your side house. A lot of people do not want to know this information, right? Because they think that their quality of life would improve if they didn't know this information. So the point where you can assume that it's a rational decision, that at any case, it can be a rational decision not to know this information, that we think that you have to leave it up to the person to make that decision, right? Because both sides can be rational. It can be really beneficial for me to know when I'm getting a heart attack, or it can be really beneficial for me to know nothing about this. Brendan cited a couple of great examples when he talked about this. Like, what if my entire moral code, which we accept in the United States, is Christianity, is not even really believing in any genetic predispositions but God? Then it's perfectly rational for me not to want to know this kind of stuff. And the point where that's a rational decision, you have to leave it up to the person rather than going back to this compulsory thing. The next thing is that the insurance agency collapse and we'll be better off. We don't think most people will be better off because it doesn't ensure that lower risk patients are going to have to pay less, which is what Brendan said. And furthermore, another thing that we have under this is that less people, as I proved in the off case, are going to be covered by health insurance in general, right? Insurance agencies are going to cut them off the board. So what does this mean for healthcare on the board? This means that you have less people covered by health insurance. This means you have more people going to America's emergency rooms and seeking the absolute most expensive type of treatment that we offer because we cannot deny those patients in the emergency room. What does this mean, Mr. Speaker? This means that taxpayers suffer when they have to pay for that emergency room care that would be much better provided by an insurance agency, which would be much more likely to provide that insurance if they didn't have this genetic information. So that's how we win the insurance agency collapse argument. The last thing under this is that it's not fundamentally different. It might not be fundamentally different. That stuff isn't good either. Thank you very much. We're very, very strong.
Thank the member of the opposition. Call upon the leader of the opposition, reminding of all the usual caveats. Here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to talk about three things in summing up today's debate case. The first thing that we're going to talk about is our principled objections to this kind of mandatory testing and the concordant discrimination that has been so wholeheartedly endorsed by the government. Our first one is that the paternalism, while Rich seems to think is justified, we find really, really offensive. We believe in the integrity of the individual and the autonomy of the individual, and they should be able to decide what information leaves their body about their body. We've said that in no other instances in the status quo do you mandate this kind of testing. And he says, give me a principal distinction between this and family histories. The principal distinction is this: you can choose not to reveal your family history. Under the government's policy, you would have no choice about revealing your genetic information. That's the first major principal distinction between the status quo and what they're proposing. The second is the one that I alluded to in my LOC, which is that there's also a difference of degree. There's clearly a lot more information in your DNA than there is in your family history. Knowing whether or not Matt's grandfather had heart disease is totally different from knowing Matt's entire genome. I think that difference of degree is substantive enough to constitute a principal distinction between the kind of information they're talking about and the kind of information we allow to circulate in the status quo. The second really important principled objection we had to their policy was that the discrimination is not only really bad, it's stupid. So first, why is it really bad? Matt and I endorse the idea that in society, and even in insurance rates, you ought to be judged more by the content of your character than by any DNA that you happen to have been born with. We say that what you do as an individual is a lot more representative of your overall health and who you are than what risks you may happen to have been born with. Now that turns out not only to be a great principled stand in favor of judging people based on their actions, which I think is really important, but it also turns out to be a better predictor of risk. Remember, how much someone drinks regardless of their predisposition toward alcoholism, or how much someone smokes regardless of their predisposition towards addictive behavior, or how much someone goes out and exercises regardless of their predisposition to obesity, are far better indicators of their overall health than those genetic risks. And we think that if you allow insurance companies to take those genetic risks into account, they're going to be charging otherwise healthy people disproportionately and unfair sums, and we think that that kind of discrimination is unfair. And not only unfair, it's stupid, because it's not necessarily a good predictor of that person's overall health from the perspective of the insurance company. The second thing I want to talk about is the insurance market. And we've had two major claims here that I think are really important. First, in response to their argument about signaling theory, that is to say, enough people will come forward with their information that insurance companies will be able to deduce information about people who don't come forward, we said, first of all, if that's true, it would be illegal, because you're effectively taking into account your assumptions about the genetic risks of people that you don't have information on into account when you charge them their premiums. If you extend the logical extension of this, the law on the status quo, is that that kind of behavior on the part of an insurance company would be legally forbidden. Now, maybe that clause isn't as explicitly clear in the language as it is on the books right now. I think it's a logical extension of the kind of status quo we're supporting. We would support extending it that way. And not only that, it might not work, because maybe not enough people will come forward to tell you their genetic risk factors. Maybe signaling theory just won't break down because not enough people will act on that information. I don't know. I haven't thought about revealing my DNA to an insurance company until you guys brought it up. So the next thing that we talked about in terms of the insurance market that's important to understand is it's non-competitive. It's an oligopoly in the United States. And as long as that is true, it means that a few people with more information doesn't necessarily translate into lower prices for everyone. And remember, because insurance companies aren't altruistic, they're interested in their bottom line. In a lot of instances, yeah, the instinct is going to be to charge higher premiums or to cut people from care in general. This leads me to my final point, and I think it's the most important in the round: healthcare overall. Realize this, Mr. Speaker. If you were an insurance company with perfect information, you would only want to cover people you knew were never going to get sick, because it means you would pay the least out and you'd take the most in. If you have a perpetual underclass of people who, because of genetic risk, are incapable of acquiring healthcare because they simply can't afford it, that means they're going to get healthcare in the America's in America's emergency medicine clinics, like places like the emergency room, like Matt talked about. That is more expensive than preventative medicine. It makes more sense to insure those people and save costs up front, because that's the way you spend the least amount of dollars on healthcare overall, and you lead to a net increase in healthcare for our society because you're spending less and getting more out. So even if they're right, and even if this is inevitable, and they propose the world they're going to live in, healthcare costs for everyone goes up, fewer people are covered. We think that is very bad for practical purposes.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition and recalled Prime Minister. Go.
Great. Thanks, everyone. One thing to clear up before I start ask my question of crystallization. First off, when we say it's compulsory for the people to give up their information, it means it's compulsory, otherwise they'll get discriminated against, right? You see the same thing in like divulging your family history. If you don't divulge your family history, you get a higher rate. If you don't divulge your genetic information, you get a higher rate. So just to clear that up, it's not like everyone absolutely has to give it up. It's if they don't give it up, they get higher rates. Like this is what it's been the entire round. You guys kind of struggle. That said, 3 questions. 1, when will insurance industries adjust rates? 2, is this a rights violation? And 3, who gets more preventative medicine? All right. So the first question I really want to ask is like, what's going to happen in the world where, in 2 different worlds? So like, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going to happen when there's no Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Insurance industries, like insurance companies, like will be free to price discriminate. Like rates for people who are likely to get disease will go up, and rates for people who are unlikely to get disease will go down. You'll have a price discriminated system. We think that there actually hasn't been a good response to this idea that on the aggregate, genetics are a really great predictor of what's going to happen to people. Since insurance companies pool risk, they're going to need the perfect institution to go ahead and do this, to go ahead and figure out like what sort of groups they can exploit. We think you're going to get that tiered insurance system on our side of the house, like no question. That sounds kind of bad, but the reason we don't mind that is because we think you get the exact same thing on their side of the house. So their only response to this is that it's illegal under the system, right? That there's no way you can possibly discriminate. But they've got 2 options, and I'm going to sort of outline this. And first is either the insurance industry has to collapse, or they're going to find ways around the system, which is what Rich and I have been maintaining our entire case. So first off, if insurance industries aren't going to be able to price discriminate against people who have revealed their genetic information, what's going to happen? I tell you this in PNC. People are going to game the system, right? You're going to adopt insurance policies that are perfectly tailored to your kind of risk, right? You're going to take out a life insurance policy right before you're about to die. You're going to get the kind of medical insurance that's going to cover you in like extreme amounts of cases, but you know it's going to happen to you. Like you know you're going to get cancer. Like this is a really bad thing, right? So what are the consequences of this? People are paying less for their insurance than they otherwise would have been. They tell you insurance industries like they can still do this and remain profitable, but this is like nonsense. If people are paying for less, paying less and getting more than what they should have, like getting the ideal insurance policy for less, insurance companies will have no choice but to sort of collapse if they're not allowed to change their prices, right? So when you don't have an area with insurance, you have to turn to like socialized medicine or personal investments to insurance. We get the win there because we have better preventative medicine systems. We have like a government database of like diseases. We have like compulsory information, and we can spend our healthcare dollars most effectively, taking words from their mouth, getting the maximum gain from the minimum dollars. Right? That's more effective, better healthcare, nicer for the house if they collapse. So what happens if they do raise rates, right? Like if they do raise rates, like people won't be buying insurance. Like who won't be buying insurance? The people who don't need insurance, right? The people who have really low genetic risks. So if people who have really low genetic risks are getting out of this higher insurance, what happens to the rest of that insurance bracket? Like the only available insurance, because it's like terrible oligopoly, right? It keeps going higher and higher because the people who can't, like, who shouldn't be in this insurance pool because it's not worth it to buy this expensive risk, just keep exiting and exiting. They keep having to hike the price higher and higher because the only group that still buys insurance are those people with the maximum risk. Again, you have the same system with the collapse of the insurance industry. Like, what's your only other option? And that is insurance industries are going to try to weasel around the system. Rich and I don't think this is entirely impossible, right? Like, insurance industries, we agree, like, they aren't these beneficial, like, hippie, tree-smiling, whatever, smug, happy people. They're going to try to get around the system. They don't care about ethical violations, right? They don't care about breaking the law. If the bottom line profits, the only way to protect us is through breaking the law. So we think you are going to get staggered information, and we think you're going to get that through, like, people, like signaling theory, like the people who are able to signal that they are healthy are going to go ahead and signal, and the insurance industry companies will have to compensate for that. So there, finally, you get a world where it's not so bad on their side, and like it's basically the same, right? Because you have this staggered insurance system where the companies price discriminate, but we think that we also get the better benefit because we have the preventative medicine argument. So two sort of possible options. Either both price discriminated industries or on their side of the house, like insurance system collapses and all we have to rely on is like some sort of socialized system. We think it's better there because of preventative medicine. Second question, is this a rights violation? So we finally get an argument from them on why there's a distinction that like Brendan alluded to in the past, and that is there's so much information out there. Well, first off is holding a contradictory position. Right? They're saying like, oh, this is bad information, then like, oh, it's such good information that it's principally different, right? They actually haven't given you a philosophical reason why this is different. They just feel like the impact of this is so great. But Mr. Speaker, like through time, we've seen advances in like what makes a good predictor of health, right? Like so, we've seen how smoking is a better and better predictor of like you getting lung disease, and we see that companies have adopted those sort of policies over time that discriminate against those sort of people. Like this isn't happening right away. We think this is going to be a gradual process over time, and companies will take this into account, right? Like we find this gene, then we find that gene, and suddenly like the cost of it goes down a little bit more, and we're able to screen more people. It's a gradual process. It's not overnight. There's going to be no point when they can draw a bright line. Like, there really is no distinction. It's just like giving up your family history. You're not saying how smart you are. You're not saying what kind of parents you have, what your behavior is. All you're saying is, I'm more likely to get this disease. The last throwaway question is, who gets better preventive medicine? I think it's us. We get people to actually do this, except for the people who take religious exemption to the rules. We get a government database that has this information. We get healthier people with less money on our side of the house. Thanks, guys.